So when I sat down this morning, Sue said, I ramble and this thing is becoming endlessly boring for any viewer. So I have to tell you in advance that I've had a very full life. I find it very difficult to leave out the important things. Today I'm going to start by telling you of two very important influences in my life. The first was my father. My father was born on the 15th of September, 1875. And he was born in Ireland, but his father immediately moved to Liverpool, where he became a customs official. As my father grew up, my grandfather's drinking increased. And when Charles, my father, was about 10, he started coming home every night drunk. And he would invariably beat up his wife and my father. By the time my father was 13, he couldn't take it any longer, so he ran away from home. And he joined a sailing ship in Liverpool harbour, and was a sailor before the mast for the next 7 years. He had travelled around Cape Horn 7 times by the time he was 19, and certainly had seen the whole world. And it's not snot hanging out of my nose. I cut myself shaving today, and that's what's there, is the scab. Anyhow, my father finally got a bit bored with sailing and joined a merchant navy ship that was coal-driven in Liverpool when he was 20. When he was 21, the ship arrived in Cape Town, and Charles so liked Cape Town that he left the ship. He heard that there was an important Orpen family in Cape Town, so he made contact with them. But when they looked at the scruffy sailor, they really didn't have any time for him and rather snobbed him. So he became a porter on the railway station for about 3 or 4 weeks, and at the end of that he joined the Cape Mounted Police as a trooper, and he had 4 years doing patrols up into Namibia on camels. His biggest delight in the Namibian desert was to get a rat or watermelon. Those were real delicacies for on-patrol troopers. When the war was formed, when the war was started, the Boer War, the Cape Mounted Police was seconded to the 3rd Battalion Light Highland Infantry. In the Boer War, my father was in the relief of Ladysmith, Mafeking, 2 other places, I can't remember them. But he became a sergeant. At the end of the war, he returned to the Cape Mounted Police, and for the next 8 years, he acted as a diamond rush starter with in the Cape Police. He would start these diamond rushes, which consisted of a horde of men, all barefoot, all on foot, who some wearing tackies, some wearing spikes, for a run to the diamond field. Then came the war, the First World War. He joined up and was made an officer in a regiment in Potchefstroom, where he trained men and would take them up to southwest Africa, where he where they would see action, and then he would return. But he never actually saw any action. He met my mother when he took long leave in 1911, writing to a cousin, an Orpen in Dublin, saying he was coming over and he wanted a wife. And this cousin introduced him to my mother, who was the seventh daughter of a farmer, Isaac Barton, down in the Midlands of Ireland. My father met her, and in 3 days they were engaged, and in another 3 days they were married. So that was a lightning affair. Dad came back first and was followed by my mother. I can't remember the name of her ship, but they saw German submarine on a couple of occasions, and the memory of the Titanic's disaster was still very fresh in people's minds. So they were rather a scared lot of passengers. I know she had an affair with some chap, a doctor, but when she arrived in Cape Town, she had to go by train to Johannesburg to be met by my father. He, of course, had, the night before, celebrating his wife's arrival, got involved in a fight and had 2 black eyes. So he was so ashamed of that that he'd met her not in Johannesburg station, but in Germiston. I think they were actually, from what all accounts, madly in love with each other. And Marcus was born in Johannesburg about a year later. And then my father joined the mines department, and he stayed with the mines department until he retired. But I've told you why he went to Pietermaritzburg previously. Marcus, was my eldest brother, was a big influence in my life. He had a very turbulent relationship with my father. My father, for some reason or other, had an obsession against boys playing sport at school. And Marcus was never able to play rugby or cricket. And when I came along, at about the age of 12, and wanted to play rugby, Marcus was the one who insisted that I did, against my mother's and father's wishes. He followed my school career very closely and was quite an influence in my life. I remember that when I made the first 11 at Maritzburg College, he bought me a Dudley Norse cricket bat, which was a tremendous asset. And all through the war, he used to write to me and keep me involved in what he was doing. So I watched the progress of the war very closely, especially in North Africa. And when the North African campaign finished, he seconded to the British Army and was in the armed a commander. He became a British commander. And he saw action when he was the forward gun position officer in the invasion of Elba, where he was wounded in the head, but he didn't die, and he came home quite whole and safe at the end of the war. So that's, and then of course we all went to Rhodesia together because he was such a personality and such a leader in our family. So now we jump to going to Knoppieslaagte. On the outskirts of Johannesburg, 56 acres, it was a small holding, and I was introduced to it through Trevor Decker, who lived next door to the property, and although he was an estate agent, he and I became good friends, and to this day we're still friends. I'm a bit older than him, but he's retired and he lives near us. I see him occasionally. But shortly after we arrived, he came and had a drink with us, and he told us all about our two ghosts. We had two ghosts on the property. The first was Riley, who was a young cavalry officer. His regiment was stationed near our house during the Boer War, and he used to go out at night to get forage for his horse. When one night he was intercepted by a Boer patrol and murdered. And he appears once a month looking for his horse. That's what we were told. Our only direct connection with Riley was one day when I was sitting in I arrived at home and I parked the Holden car which we owned near the front door. And about an hour later, the hooter started blowing and the lights went on. There was no reasonable explanation for this, except that we all thought it was Riley come to visit us. The other ghost we never actually saw, but he was supposed to be a miner who was walking up the road dressed in a brown suit with a waistcoat and one of those old-fashioned shirts where you had a separate collar, but he had no collar nor any tie, and a brown bowler hat. But he was supposed to be, in Trevor Decker's opinion, much more real than Riley. Living at Knoppieslaagte was great fun, especially in the autumn when we had to put out fires. I'm not sure we ever actually started any fires, but we always had to put out fires, which meant that the whole family was out with sacks beating fires. Very good for us, and we loved it. We had a swimming pool there, which all four sons loved playing in, always in their nude, unless a visitor came, and then they would scat for the house to get clothed. If you ask them, I think they'll tell you that it was the happiest home they've ever lived in. We eventually sold it to Oliver Jessel, and through that sale the Jessels and the Orpens became long-term friends. This is where I started breeding pheasants. A friend of mine, John Croxford, had started the pheasant business, but he didn't have the patience to wait for the whole process. And for us it became a very involved operation. I managed to buy a big incubator, second hand, which we moved to and put in a garage. We had to disassemble it and then reassemble it, and we could breed the pheasants in that incubator. Then I built little houses for the young pheasants to be moved into, and we built about 15 what were called arks. This is where about 6 or 7 pheasant hens, accompanied by one cock, would spend the spring when they would lay their eggs. And we had a piccaninny, can't remember his name, but his mother was Mary, who worked in our house. No, it wasn't Umshlawuli. It was before Umshlawuli. Anyhow, he would, as the eggs were laid, he'd pick them up and take them into the garage, and then once a week we would set all those eggs in our new incubator. At this stage, I was married to Juliana, and I hadn't left control data. But while I was in America on a trip, she met Ian Calder. And when I came back from America, she told me that she wanted a divorce, which quite shattered me. I never knew why. It was never properly explained to me what I'd done wrong. But I've always presumed that it was my fault. However, with the passage of time and the fact that I've married Sue for such a long time, I think the problem was Ian Calder. My first wife, Juliana, fell in love with him, and why not? And so we got divorced. And then a number of girlfriends followed, until finally George Robinson and Sheldine introduced me to Sue, and we were married in Durban. Our reception was in George Robinson's house, and our honeymoon was in Swaziland at the small game reserve there, where we had an exciting adventure with an ostrich. I was driving our brand new Citroen, loaded up with wedding presents, when we got stuck in a river. So Sue and I got out and started walking towards where we thought the game ranger lived. The road had recently been scraped, and on either side was a very small mound. And we were walking along the boundary, which was about an 8 or 9 foot, 10 foot high fence, when suddenly I noticed an ostrich, or 4 ostriches, approaching us. And the male ostrich was in front of all of them. I remember that when I was in Standard 3, we had an Afrikaans set book which described the behavior of angry ostrich males. And when I was quite sure he was going to attack us, I told Sue to get down. So she lay down next to this minute mound of soil. There was no other protection. And Mr. Twinkletoes, as I discovered he was called, then attacked me. He charged me, and I remember pulling off a shoe and flinging at him. And he turned round at the end of his charge and came back, so he got the other shoe. Each time I flung something at him, he would fly up and strike the object with his toe until I was just down to my pants. my precious camera was also somewhere in the bush, but it failed to hit him. Suddenly we heard a big truck approaching on the other side of the fence. It was carrying timber, cut trees. It was a 20-tonner. So Sue shinned up the wire fence while I tried to keep the ostrich occupied. And then when she was on the other side, she started shouting at the ostrich, which took his attention away sufficiently long for me to shin up the fence and get over. So the driver of the truck took us to the nearest garage, where we told our story to the owner, and he knew all about Twinkle Toes, having heard that he'd attacked many people, many visitors to the reserve. So he took us in his Land Rover back to the river where our car was, and he pulled the car out of the river, and we were able to start it and got going. The first thing I did was to drive back to where we'd had the fracas with the ostrich, and collected my shoes and my camera and shirt and everything else. And then Mr. Twinkle Toes was at our window, which was slightly open, so I told Sue to close it, and I could take off and drag to Twinkle Toes, but she was too soft-hearted. We drove away. Okay. Shortly after that, we organized a party at our house on the 31st of October, which was to celebrate Roger's birthday. And that's when I had a heart attack. But as I'd been under the care of a doctor for a little while before that, it was not as severe as it could have been. It was a coronary thrombosis. I was in hospital for about 6 weeks after that. And then when I came out, I'd stopped smoking and I stopped drinking for a year, which gave me a new lease on life. I started running and generally looked after myself. Kate, Juliana, herself wasn't in good form at all. This is when her schizophrenia condition reared itself, and she spent quite a long time in Tara. It was when she came out of Tara that our divorce was finalized. Adam was born at Knoppislachter, and then shortly after that we sold Knoppislachter to Oliver Jessel, who was then a young financial whiz kid out from England, worth millions, buying up land left, right and centre, and he bought our place as a residence for his family. We had the whole family out once. That was a terrible experience. He had 6 daughters and young Simon. So I realized that we had, although we had a long-term lease as part of our sale, I realized we had to move out, and I found a property in Knoppislachter, which was, we called it Little Clutch, because we were still doing the pheasants. And we set up the pheasant business at Little Clutch. And it was at Little Clutch that Pheasant was born. And she was very young when we left Little Clutch, which we had to do because we couldn't replace the bond that we bought it with. And we moved to Moy, which was right next to the Johannesburg sewage farm. that was great fun for us because the Yuxkay River travelled along one boundary, and we had many picnic parties in the evening on the banks of the Yuxkay. Mark Taylor and his wife Annie came for many of our evening picnics, which we had down on the river banks, and we always ended up by sailing little paper boats down the river. But then the pressure from the owners of Moinoi was too much for me. They wanted me to buy it, and they offered me a bond, which in those days was a hell of a lot of money and a high rate of interest. So we looked for another place, and we found Swartkop, which in fact was a much nicer house. It had a swimming pool. Yes, it did. 4 bathrooms. Moinoi was 100 acres, so it felt a bit of a come down going to Swartkop, which was only 29 acres. But it was a much nicer 29 acres. We had good neighbours, English-speaking neighbours, with whom we got on very well. And there we had stables for 6 horses. Pheasant became very interested in riding, and I gave her a half Arab pony for her 10th birthday, I think it was. She became very attached to that. Bambi was her name. She entered many gymkhanas and show events with Bambi. We left Moinoi because the bank put the bond rate up from 12.5% to 25%, and I couldn't keep that up. So we moved to where we now live, and we bought this place. This is only 10 acres. And it was from here that I became a councillor for the Democratic Alliance, which I enjoyed being very much, except that quite soon I realized that the Democratic Alliance was not an extension of the Progressive Party, but an extension of the Nationalist Party. Tony Leon had formed a coalition outside. When the Nationalist Party lost power, Tony Leon formed this coalition between the Progressive Party and the Nationalists. And here in Krugersdorp, just about all the Democratic Alliance, the name of the new party, were recruited. And Krugersdorp was a hotbed of nationalists. So most of our DA members were nationalists, except 2 or 3 of us. I was one of the 2 or 3. So I tended to work very much on my own. I concentrated on Kagiso, which is the name of the black township right next to Krugersdorp. I enjoyed it very much. I made lots of black friends there. I also operated a soup kitchen entirely on my own, with vegetables I got from Toscana farm, and the bones I got from various butcheries. And that was a great success, but except that I had to do it all on my own because none of the nationalists were prepared to help me. They thought I was too liberal, sucking up to the blacks. So at the very next election, I was not elected by the DA to join them. So those 5 years were the total extent of my experience as a town councillor. I'm sorry I had to give it up because I enjoyed the work very much indeed. But I didn't enjoy the backstabbing and scandal mongering amongst all the nats. And my biggest enemy was a retired police general. How he got into the DA, I don't know. A great part of my life has been shared with Sue. Back at Knoppeslachter, she got an idea that she wanted to take her honours in English. And one day, the two of us were sitting in our office, and she was writing an appreciation of Johnson. When I said to her, "Why are you wasting your time with this? Why don't you do some art that you do so well?" Which she did. So she gave up the honours degree in English and concentrated on her art. And she started off by painting goose eggs, which were a great success. And she sold most of them on Thursday morning markets at the Waldorf Craft Market. Then she started teaching to a number of pupils, and that was also highly successful. Now she'd graduated from duck's eggs to painting furniture. And we still have some of her painted tables, which sold very well indeed. I think her best sellers were toy boxes. But it was all grist to the mill for her. She grew with her art, and finally, when we moved to where we are now, she was able to bring all her pupils and put them in a decent classroom and have a gallery of her own. And meeting Barbara Bailey as one of her pupils was a great experience, because it was through Barbara Bailey she met Fiona, who came from Scotland and wanted her to do an exhibition in Edinburgh. Fiona and Barbara were running a charity for HIV/AIDS positive girls in Lanseria. And this exhibition that Sue was going to put up was in aid of that charity. So it was agreed she would paint 40 paintings, mostly in watercolor, which she was very good at, and the paintings were all framed and air freighted to Edinburgh, ready for the opening day. Sue was going to fly over 3 days before the opening and hang all the pictures, because she was convinced only she knew how to hang them properly. Anyhow, she went off to England, having got her visas and all her papers, we thought, in order. But she had been guided by the travel agent. And when she arrived at Heathrow Airport, the Indian immigration official wanted to know why she was coming to England, and being a thoroughly truthful person, she said she was coming for an exhibition. Well, they said that she was not allowed to do that. So to cut a long story short, they bundled her into a cell and put her on a plane the next night and sent her back to South Africa. This was a terrible humiliation for her. But she got over it, because through that scandal of arresting an artist who'd come for a charity purpose, she sold nearly all her paintings. Her arrest hit the headlines in the New Scotsman, which is the leading Edinburgh newspaper. Roger married Mandy Pryor, and they have 2 sons, Chester and Oscar. But Roger decided that Cape Town was a better potential for his future, so they moved to Cape Town, and that's where they live, and they are very happy down there. The next one to get married was Titus, and he has 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Ronzi, Niall and Tate. Ronzi is just about at the end of her school career and is hoping to be a vet. She's a lovely girl, a very good sportswoman and very clever at her work. But it's a financial burden to educate them at private schools. So Titus has undertaken to launch a home education system for Niall and Tate. Mungo and Marion lived together for many years before they got married, and then finally they had a daughter, Josephine. Josephine is a lovely girl and goes to the same school that all her uncles went to, St. Peter's. There is a split in those 2 families between Marion and Titus, and they don't talk. It's a source of constant distress to me. And now we have Pheasant married, and Pheasant has a most beautiful little granddaughter for me, Abigail. She's married to Vaughan Reed, has taken on the name Orpen Reed. And I think that Vaughan is going to find his feet very quickly and make a success of business. Adam was married shortly after Pheasant and Vaughan were married. He married Lisa. And they now have 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy is Tom, and the girl is Vivian. Tom looks as though he's going to be like his maternal grandfather, who's a giant of a man, of German extraction, already Tom, although he's much younger than Abigail, is taller than her. Adam is well on his way up the ladder of the computer business. I don't know where it's going to end. But he's very happily married to Lisa. Okay?
What about your retirement?
Oh, now I've retired. And I'm really retired because I've lost my balance. I don't know how this happened, but I found myself falling. So I went to my GP and asked him what was wrong, and he sent me on to a specialist who said, you've lost your balance. It's incurable. If you go to an ENT, possibly they can improve your balance, but it's never cured. So I'm currently regularly doing exercises, and I think my balance has slightly improved. I ride a bike. Yesterday I did 7 kilometers. So I hope to be back doing at least 50 kilometers within a year. And I think that's pretty good for an 85-year-old.
Generally, hasn't it?
Mine?
Yeah.
Oh, it couldn't have been fuller. I don't think so anyhow. And if I had it my time over again, I'd do it all the same. And I've enjoyed my life. Well, I think I have. I tell you, I was terribly unhappy over my divorce. I couldn't understand it.
Well, you found a good woman.
Absolutely. I did better. And that's not unkind. I was so glad when I got that photograph of Juliana's headstone, which said Juliana Lester, and not Kate. Because she was never Kate for me, she was always Juliana. I still can't believe that she's gone. I sometimes think of her as right next to me. Do you know that?
Well, I don't think you would have coped without Sue in the last 20 years. Well, you wouldn't have.
You mean on my own?
Yeah.
No. No. No, she's a fabulous wife. Fabulous wife. And she sees me as her responsibility now, which I find very difficult to accept. I can't accept it.